we meet in an hour of change and challenge, in a decade of hope and fear, in an age of both knowledge and ignorance. If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
Welcome to another episode of the Energy Impact Podcast. My guest today is Robert Hoagland, a climate advisor at Marginal Carbon. Robert, great to have you on.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
So before we hear about Marginal Carbon and everything you're working on today, tell us more about yourself. Where are you from?
I'm from Stockholm, Sweden. But yeah, currently living in different places. My wife's a diplomat, so right now I'm in Bangkok, but we've been in Jakarta as well before. So going back and forth to various places around the world.
Wow. So did you grow up in Sweden then?
Yeah, correct.
Okay. For how long? Like 10 years? 30 years?
No, I mean the diplomat stuff is when I got married, basically. So essentially 29 years or something. But minus traveling, but not living abroad.
Okay, fantastic. And tell us about your education path. Like, would you know what you wanted to study? Like, how did you end up in climate?
Yeah, the climate part wasn't really part of the education to start with. Started out in the communications world, really. I studied comms and then started working in the NGO sector, working for large international NGOs on sort of PR communication campaigns, going into climate about 2015, where I started something called the Climate Goal Initiative, that a network or coalition that brought together 22 organizations to get Sweden to adopt a new target to also reduce emissions from consumption. So essentially like Sweden's scope 3 emissions, what happens in other countries, that there should be targets to and measures to do that. So a lot of big NGOs. And Sweden has an agreement to do it, but it's not law yet. So hopefully it will actually become part of it. But yeah, started that network, and then I worked at Oxfam, which is a big INGO, and could continue working with climate policy for Oxfam. And from there, going into more kind of carbon removal and how companies best can contribute to climate.
Interesting. How did you arrive, or what drove you to switch from sort of a broader communications focus to climate specifically?
I think what motivates me is to try to help solve difficult problems that are important for the world and bring about impact. And to me personally, I felt it was a bit more tangible and clearer to work on like actual issues that has things like policy objectives. We want Sweden to adopt this target, where it's quite clear if we succeed with this that it leads to something. If we get more companies to support climate projects, that has a very tangible impact. If we can develop new carbon removal projects, it becomes more kind of concrete, and it's very clear what I've done to help advance action towards reaching the global climate targets, which is one of the biggest challenges, of course, that humanity faces. Whereas when you're just working with comms, especially if you do branding or PR, it can be a little bit more unclear exactly what you're contributing to, even though it can be very important as well.
Yeah, there's certainly value in storytelling, of course. But could you be maybe a little more specific? Was there like a particular article or book or driver of that switch, or was it sort of an aggregate of reading about things and in 2015 it wasn't such an obvious right, there weren't the tailwinds in 2015 as there are today.
Maybe it goes back to being interested in sort of big problems and sort of what are the ways that the people are working to solve them. I got involved in a network that was working on kind of more sustainable growth, or putting sustainability before growth. So sort of a bit growth skeptic back in the time, and then sort of saw that it was kind of illogical that Sweden did not care at all about the emissions that were outside the country in the official policies and the targets. So it was kind of identifying a gap and then seeing like, okay, but I can actually get involved here. I could start doing something. So that was the first way in. Although before that, I was still sort of engaged in sustainability, like writing about that, op-eds, etc., but not exactly working in it. So for me, it was more kind of identifying like, okay, I can have a big marginal impact here. There's a chance for me. No one else is actually doing this. And I would say it's the same. That was kind of the first transition into climate. And the second one is on carbon removal. And there, this new industry started to emerge. I was interested in it, so I started looking up answers to the questions I couldn't find the answers to. When I worked at Oxfam, we were also interested in it, both from like Oxfam Sweden's perspective. It's something that organizations should actually go and support, but also from the international perspective, where maybe there's more suspicion about it. So I wrote together a paper that became a discussion paper that was published by Oxfam in 2020, Removing Carbon Now, looking into how companies and individuals can help fund or support carbon removal projects. And I think that was a sort of a good entry point where I saw that, okay, this new field is interesting. There's a lot of unsolved questions that not too many people are working on. Like there's a lot of stuff to do here. The industry doesn't really exist. There's a few early companies. And then, I could have a big marginal impact here because I'm interested in it and I started doing the work. So that's why I got into it, really.
Cool. Yeah, tell us about some of those unsolved questions that people aren't focusing on.
The whole idea about the carbon removal is needed. It's not exactly new, but it's become much more prominent in the sort of global debate since, let's say, after the IPCC 1.5 report in 2018, I think it was, and then like 2019, 2020 started taking off. I think 2021, when you see a lot of media, sort of big media that previously never talked about carbon removal, covering some of the early companies that are starting to do that. There is so many questions around both sort of the technicalities, like which solutions are actually best at removing carbon and how can they be scaled up in a way that is sustainable, that doesn't create any sort of difficulties where it creates risks or resource to take too much resources, take too much land, etc. So like, how do we develop completely new technologies that are effective at taking CO2 out of the air? Is it kind of a technical problem, and we see a lot of exciting new solutions all the time with new companies that are sort of in the lab. Very promising approach. No one thought of that before. It's not just sort of the ideas that are old and we knew how they were working. It's actually people coming up with completely new ideas. But then there's lots of questions of like, how can this be supported in the best way? How can you create it? Is the market, how big part of the market should private actors have? How should a government best support something like this? Like, how to make sure that carbon removal doesn't stop people from reducing their emissions? How should projects be governed? Like, how are the ways that we should compare like the longevity of carbon? Like, some projects are permanent. You take the CO2 out of the air, you store it on the ground forever as rock, or for example, but other projects store it for a more shorter duration of time. Like, can those even be compared? That's a question I thought a lot about and written a lot about. I think it's interesting. And then also, like, what are the types of claims companies should be doing? What are the best strategies for companies that want to help reach global net zero? Yeah, those are the type of things that I think are interesting and I'm working on.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay, well, a lot to peel back there. Tell us more about some of these interesting technologies. Like, which are you most excited about?
Well, the key thing is really that for carbon removal, we do need a portfolio approach, because essentially every method runs into different problems of scalability when they are at very large scale. We might come up with a method that avoids it, but so far we do have a lot of possibilities to use photosynthesis to capture CO2, like trees and plants, You can do that in a way that also stores the carbon in a durable way. For example, if you take crop waste and heat it up over 600 degrees Celsius to make biochar, which is a stable form of carbon, then you can put that back into soils and have increased crop yields, etc. But that's limited to how much waste biomass you have. And if you're planting trees or crops to capture the CO2 on land that you didn't use that before, then it's land that's something that holds it back. For energy intensive solutions like direct air capture, it is the sort of how fast can we build fossil-free energy, and how much can we scale up from that point of view. Some of them have other resource constraints. And then like you can use minerals to capture CO2, grinding up rocks like olivine, for example, capturing CO2 from the air. But then, you know, it's more kind of limited to how many mines do you want to open, like how much rock do you have access to. So like the best planning scenario for setting up billions of tons of CO2 is going to utilize quite a lot of many different types of methods, because then you're not sort of overly pushing for one thing that runs into problems from scale. So it is kind of that portfolio approach. But there is a lot of exciting innovations. It's basically all of these areas, oceans too, and maybe the most highest amounts of companies that are doing research maybe are in the kind of technical direct air capture side, like finding new ways of doing that. But yeah, we've seen a lot of action in all sides here.
Yeah, really cool. And perhaps we should, I skipped over it because I agree that carbon removal is a pretty critical piece, right? Because otherwise all we're talking about is rate of change. But perhaps give the thesis of carbon removal, you know, for our audience,
Yeah.
You know, why is it so important in
Sure.
the broader net zero goal?
So as long as there is emissions going on, the Earth continues to warm. So it is not enough that emissions are starting to drop from 35, 40 billion tons to 10 billion tons, even though that would be a huge decrease in emissions, like something that would be extremely worth celebrating. You would still have warming going up year by year, because you need to reach zero essentially to have zero warming as well. And it's going to be very difficult to reach zero, because there's a lot of emissions that we're not exactly sure how we should reduce them to zero. Some might be very expensive to do so. So there is a need to also remove carbon to reach this net zero stage. It might also be that maybe you have emissions in some parts of the world, like China, or other parts, whereas EU and the US might reach sort of close to zero emissions themselves, and then you need to counterbalance to reach a global net zero, maybe because you have to sort of offset your trade emissions or something like that. And also, if you want to reduce the warming, like going back in time, maybe you reach 2-degree warming and you want to bring it back to 1.5, then also you have to bring that carbon out to the atmosphere and back into the ground.
Yeah, I think that to me is the critical piece, right? Say you could snap your fingers and we could be at net zero new emissions. Well, carbon dioxide is an incredibly stable molecule. We're going to continue to have warming. We would just change the rate of that increase, right? So yeah, I think that is lost in the sort of news bite debate that we have as a society.
No, exactly. I think a lot of people who are not thinking about climate too much might think that if emissions are reduced, then temperatures are reduced too. So
yeah. Okay. Well, so tell us about what you do with Marginal Carbon. How did the idea? Because you kind of told us how the idea came about, but what are you sort of working to accomplish there?
Yeah. Marginal Carbon is my company where I just sort of conduct my business. I work with different clients, where the biggest one is Milky Wire, which is an impact platform based in Sweden, but working all over the world, where it's set up to get more money into environmental causes and make giving easier, like both with technical ways, but also setting up funds that are selecting good organizations. So I work with Milky Wire for more than 2 years now. I set up something called the Climate Transformation Fund, and I continue to manage it for Milky Wire, where we basically have an alternative to offsetting, supporting solutions to help reach global net zero. Companies are donating to this charitable fund, and then we're pre-purchasing or making offtake agreements for permanent carbon removal, supporting organizations within reforestation or protecting forests, like many grassroots organizations, for example, and then organizations working on decarbonization. such as advocacy and policy projects like Clean Air Task Force, for example. And we have groups that have been conducting thousands of hours of research on like what is the most cost-effective way of bringing about sort of transformation, like Giving Green, which is a great group. And their analysis shows that these kind of advocacy and policy organizations that have been effective and a good track record are orders of magnitude more cost-effective in supporting when you want to bring down emissions. So that's why we're also supporting that kind of solutions. So it's a charitable fund. We're supporting organizations for the third year now. We just did a call for proposals. We're getting 240 applications from like really good projects. So I mean, at Works right now, evaluating those projects, talking to a lot of carbon removal companies, getting insights into the, new super exciting approaches. And then we're getting more donors as well on the corporate side. The fintech Klarna was the first donor. They're using an internal carbon fee, so sort of voluntarily taxing themselves. Microsoft does that as well, and some others. $100 per ton for scope 1, 2, and travel, and $10 for rest, and using the money to support projects then selected for this climate transformation fund. And we have a bunch of for other corporate donors as well.
Fascinating. I'm maybe talk a little bit about how some of this carbon accounting helps create a marketplace for this type of industry. Because I think there's quite a few people doing it on a voluntary basis. You have, some SEC rumblings, at least here in the US, on turning that to be maybe a little bit more quasi-voluntary. Is that the most successful path, you think, for creating I don't want to say artificial demand, but pricing that externality?
Yeah. Carbon accounting?
Yeah.
Yeah, I do think it is quite important to make companies not only just realize their impact, but also have a way of connecting their contribution to something. So basic idea is if you're causing emissions, like you don't want to, but if you're a player in the global economy, you're going to have emissions from your purchases or whatever, you might be able to reduce them quickly depending on what industry you're in, and also sort of how much of your emissions are with you rather than your suppliers. But then you want to ideally do something about those emissions that you weren't able to reduce. And you can look at it from several ways. You can look at it from sort of what's the cost of these emissions in terms of the damage they cause. So there's something called the social cost of carbon. I'm sure you know about it. And governments make their own calculations. Now UK, US, and German government are sort of hovering around $200 per ton, and the sort of long-term global cost of a 1 ton of CO2 emissions in terms of deaths and economic damage, etc. And then it could be reasonable to say that a company that can afford it should support climate projects, could pay that cost into climate projects. And you can also turn it on its head and sort of look at what's the cost of actually removing the emissions then. And then that's also going to be in that price range, like $100 to $200 long term. Some of the technical solutions are much more expensive now, but if you look at Biochar, for example, it's around $150. Problem there is that you don't have that much supply of carbon removal being removed today. So the best thing is actually to support new solutions and not care about so much about how many tons you're getting. Actually sort of going into where you think it's most impactful. So if you're taxing yourself, it's not the same that you're offsetting. You're getting a lump sum of money, and then you are just trying to spend that as the most effective way as possible, like getting as much bang for your buck as possible. And that means that you're not making like a neutrality claim right now, for example. You're saying that you're helping reach global net zero. But carbon accounting is key to determining how much you're contributing.
And it's a funny I guess you could call it a tragedy of the commons, right? It's as a global problem, there is a bit of a prisoner's dilemma on each country, right? How do you create a global marketplace with sort of norms and standards and pricing that, someone's going to have to bear? Have you seen traction or progress around that front? I mean, I think there's a lot of press and politicians sort of speaking to a solution, but I don't know. Sometimes in my pessimistic moments, I'm like, well, we got to do something about it, right?
Yeah. no, sure. Like a global price on carbon is not going to happen anytime soon. I think a few people think that, but there's a lot of things that individual actors or groups of actors can do. I mean, the EU is of course a good example. Now the US has taken a lot of action as well internally. There are sort of clubs of countries and then companies that could band together, do things together, or just sort of adopt principles like we're voluntarily paying for this kind of these emissions that we have. So yeah, there's a few systems that are actually doing this, like cap and trade system. The EU is the biggest, but outside of that, outside of setting up those kind of new systems, I think voluntary action can go a really long way, especially in catalyzing new climate technologies, where sort of you don't need that much money in the beginning, and since not that many people are doing it, you can have a huge impact if you're actually going in and starting helping out and supporting that.
Yeah, and I guess, yeah, that's key, is that as we're sort of building this marketplace, it is those voluntary first movers that demonstrate that it works, that it can be economic, and really price is irrelevant at some point. High prices cure high prices, and so that signal is needed. Yeah, really interesting. What are some of the big, or maybe there aren't any, but what do people sort of say if they take the opposite position of you? Like, what are the arguments that you are handling most frequently?
Well, I mean, it depends on sort of what argument we're talking about, because I mean, it could be like, is it the specific approach for alternative offsetting, or is someone critical against carbon removal? Those will be different. Which one are you thinking mostly?
Let's do them both. I guess that's what I'm trying to. That's what I kind of want to prod.
Sure, let's start with carbon removal then.
So
I think the most common objection is that carbon removal sort of takes the focus away from emission reductions, so that the mere possibility of removal solutions in the future are sort of making people slow down on emission reductions because they think it's like an easy fix or something. My argument back to that is that, like, if you're emission reduction pathways that are in the future, they're also for these kind of hard to abate sectors, they're also expensive, and if someone is looking to remove their carbon with permanent carbon removal, they're going to see that's going to cost like over $100. Are we going to be able to afford that, or should we start reducing our emissions? Like, to me, if you frame it in the right way and not like it's cheap offsets for $5 a piece, but actually showing what the real cost is, then like that was incentivize action instead, because then you see like, oh my god, we actually have to reduce emissions, because otherwise we're up for a huge bill when we're going to reach our net zero target. So I think it can be, if you explain how expensive it actually is going to be, it can be sort of a catalyst for action as well. I think one key argument here also is that if you're looking kind of at a cost curve, a marginal abatement cost curve, looking at like different types of solutions and what they cost, you have these kind of relatively cheap things like fossil-free energy, like solar and wind power is often cheaper than the fossil energy anyway. It's other bottlenecks, so it's not that difficult to go into that. That's kind of a cheap win. But then it's sort of further on, you have solutions that are not quite sort of ready yet. Solutions for cement and steel and nitrous oxide from agriculture, and then emissions from airplanes, for example. And then, for those type of emissions, carbon removal could be an option as well. If the cost of abating those emissions is really high and far away, then carbon removal becomes an option to that. But it sort of, if you see the whole sort of palette of things, then carbon removal is just one tool in the toolbox. But if we don't have it, then we can't reduce temperatures back to what they were, and it's going to be really, really difficult to reach net zero, and also much more expensive, I think, than if you didn't have carbon removal in the toolbox.
Yeah, your point at the beginning is super interesting. Do we really care? I think the core of it is, do you really care if a company is eliminating their carbon emissions, period, versus just removing them? And I think basically the answer is no, right? You don't really care which path they go, but it is clearly cheaper given the marginal cost today of reducing your emissions, but that may not always be the case. That's that seems like it seems pretty obvious the way you describe it there.
Just adding the caveat there, like, of course, then the removals would have to be like permanent. If you continue to emit fossil fuels, like in burning that and adding to the atmosphere. If you then removing carbon to offset that, then it needs to be permanent carbon removal, like very long-term storage. And also the carbon removal then shouldn't have like any other disadvantages, right? Like forcing people off their land or something like that. So,
Yeah.
but in theory, like if you have a solution that does not have those kind of bad effects, and sort of your continued emissions to also not have any other bad effects, such as environmental pollution aside from CO2. It's like all those caveats need to be added onto it, though. Like, because often fossil emissions have lots of other bad things around, like communities getting polluted waters, or like that also needs to be taken into account. But yeah, in principle, I think carbon removal is a tool in a toolbox that maybe you're going to decide that you're going to continue burning kerosene in an airplane, like oil, and instead do direct air capture and permanently store that, instead of making synthetic fuels where you take CO2 from the air and then transform that into fuels, because that takes more electricity. So then it might be okay to actually use oil, but like completely remove it all. That might be sort of the cheapest way, and then it could also be the most sustainable way if you look at resource use. Like, I'm not saying it necessarily is, but it's definitely possible.
Yeah, and I think there's the caveats are good ones, because the truth is all of these have some sort of trade-off associated with them, always and forever, right? That there is, and I personally think sometimes we let the perfect be the enemy of really great, right? And that, like, yeah, something, there's gonna use some land use, there's gonna be some mineral use, like that's just not,
yeah.
like we just can't not have that.
Whatever you do, right? Like,
yeah.
But then of course there's some people advocating for like a completely different lifestyle, cut resource use in half or something. I think I used to be kind of more in that group before. Now, sort of looking at sort of human psychology, politics, etc., I do think the kind of more abundance now, sort of just get shitloads of fossil-free energy. I do believe kind of more in that approach now, in terms of what would actually get traction, what will actually work, rather than sort of asking people to consume 50% less or something like that.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe talk more about, I have some strong opinions here too. We'd love to maybe debate a little bit, but talk to us more about that evolution.
Yes. So I used to write a lot of op-eds and stuff around this topic. I think I still stand for the sort of general conclusions that sustainability is a more important goal than growth, and like you shouldn't you shouldn't let your growth targets sort of force you from not taking action on climate or something like that. Like, oh my God, we're not getting 5% GDP growth, like then we can't do this new climate tax or something. But we did see that kind of things happening, especially like 10 years or so ago. So I think that was a key point. But I think the focus on sort of reducing consumption, reducing resource use from individuals, it is important, and it definitely helps. But in terms of what motivates people, in terms of what also helps the world in other aspects, like resource use can be really bad because it can reduce biodiversity and stuff, so it has to be done in a responsible way. But then also energy use is, for example, very tightly connected to human development in other countries that are poor already, so it doesn't correlate like forever, but up to a degree. So that the world at large need to use more energy, I think, like I believe strongly, especially in places where they don't use that much. So globally, the energy use just has to go up a lot. And like the way that we can do that is not by the West sort of saving on energy that much, like, and it can help a little bit. I just believe that kind of abundance agenda where we focus on building lots of fossil-free power as fast as possible, like in the same way as France and Sweden did with the nuclear build out in the 70s, for example. It is possible. Like the amount of electricity that they were able to put on the grids in a very short period of time was astonishing, and it can be done again for sure. I just think that kind of vision is also a lot more appealing to people.
Yeah, no, I very much agree with that outlook. I mean, for both really the two core reasons you just discussed. Like, it's just not realistic to have people cut back at such degrees. You know, you see some of these like, oh, net zero is easily accomplished, and you dig into the paper and they're assuming people cut energy use by 50%, right? And you're like,
Yeah.
in what world, you know? But yeah, I think to me, that's why carbon removal makes so much sense in that, you know, pricing those externalities and solving the core problem is obviously critical. Well, yeah, very interesting. Okay, well, so you've got 200 and some applications here for your transformation fund. What do the next 5 years look like for you and Marginal Carbon?
So I continue working with Milky Wire now. I think it's great, the fund that we were able to grow, and the concept where you take this impact first approach and also use an internal carbon fee, I think is growing and sort of helping that grow with other companies. The other things that I do besides Milky Wire is, for example, working with a think tank called Carbon Gap, which works on carbon removal in Europe, a little bit similar to Carbon 180 in the US. So we wrote a paper last year on sort of who can pay for climate action and carbon removal. Foresee continue doing things like that with them. I write a lot on my own Substack as well, like trying to solve things like, not solve, but give input and sort of work out a bit from my perspective on things like permanence and who pays for, how can the market for carbon removal get kickstarted, and what are different levels that will help carbon removal grow. So I look forward to continue working on problems like that and sort of helping the sector in ways that are sustainable, and then inputting on different various policy things. Like I'm in this EU expert on carbon removal as an observer member, working out like certification ways that the EU can work on certifying carbon removal, working out with people like Gold Standard and inputting to the Science-Based Target on sort of what are the best corporate approaches when it comes to carbon removal and corporate climate action, things like that. I enjoy to work with, to come with new ideas, new best practices, like write white papers, get new case studies done with companies, stuff like that.
Very cool. You've mentioned this sort of permanence question a couple of times. Like, maybe give us a little more information on, you know, what that looks like. Where are we storing this? What do you consider more permanent versus not permanent?
I have a graph in one of my posts that gives a classification of this. The most permanent way of storing CO2 is when it's turned into a rock, when it's pumped underground in a way where it's very stable and eventually also turns into a solid. If you're pumping sort of bio oil into the subsurface, you're mineralizing CO2 as rocks. Like there are ways that it's very, very difficult to get that carbon back, and there's sort of intermediary ways like biochar that slowly breaks down and gives some CO2 back, but it takes hundreds of years. And then there are the ways where you store carbon in the short carbon cycle. So fossil emissions comes from the long cycle. You're digging up oil, you're digging up coal. It wasn't in the atmosphere before, just adding that on. But if you capturing that back into trees, then you're taking from the long cycle and putting it back into short cycle. Like it can still be effective in a way, but it's not equal from the different cycles. So there is a risk that those forests are reversed, that they're sort of dying from forest fires or cut down, on that someone decides that this should be farmland in the future. So it's not functionally the same thing. It wouldn't be permissible to say, like, yeah, we're going to continue burn oil because we're planting these trees. Like it might still be a good idea to plant the trees, but it wouldn't be like this offset relationship. So you have a concept that's called like for like removals. That's UNFCCC, the UN's campaign, that they have a campaign called Race to Zero, also use, and many others. That if you have this long-lived emissions from fossil sources, then you should store the carbon in the same way. But if you have emissions from, let's say you're cutting down a forest to build a new city or something, those emissions are from the short carbon cycle, so they could be offset with trees somewhere else, for example. Like everything else to be equal, but and the same with soil or methane emissions. So that principle, I think, it's a really good sort of benchmark for how to think about when you compensating.
Yeah, critical nuance there, right? And you could imagine how there's different tiers of pricing or something, or
Yeah.
right, like as it shows up on the balance sheet and you're paying that, you know, as a liability, and you're paying that off in different ways, it can be classified differently. Huh, really interesting. Well, okay, so I think we covered a lot of stuff. Anything that we didn't talk about that we should?
We can always go really deep in all of these topics, right? Like, there's so many nuances to all of the things that we talked about, and each of them can be like several hours of discussion. So I guess we covered a lot of the most relevant topics of the things that I work on. I'm also collaborating on something called CDR.FYI, which is a website that tracks all the known purchases of carbon removal, so you can see how small the sector is. It's for durable or permanent storage. It doesn't track forestation, for example, because that's an old sector, and it's would be extremely difficult to actually track it. So people can check that out if you want to see who is buying carbon removal from whom, and what type of solutions.
Yeah, really interesting. Can you give us a sense, like how big is that market from a tons per year perspective?
So it was about pre-purchases and offtake agreements was around 700,000 tons last year. So I mean, we're emitting like 40 billion tons. So I mean, extremely small amount, and deliveries were even smaller, like carbon that actually was removed. So that was like 35,000 tons. This is known carbon removal, like they are sold as carbon removal. So, for example, there are more biochar products that don't sell carbon credits, but they're removing carbon in a sense. So it doesn't cover all the carbon removal activities that happen in the whole world, but it covers sort of the market, or at least a known market, and we think they were capturing most of it. But if you look, I think one number that really sticks with me is like how many companies bought more than 1,000 tons last year of durable carbon removal. You want to guess?
More than 1,000 tons.
And that's like most companies have like tens of thousands of tons of emissions, right?
I would guess 35.
Yeah, it's a good guess. Yeah, it's a really good guess. It's not a lot of companies. It's 16.
Wow. Okay.
So last year. So this kind of Microsoft, Shopify, like Milky Wire and Klarna that we work with. There's like the Stripe and Frontier and Swiss Re, and there's a few sort of enthusiasts, very much first movers, but most companies haven't sort of gotten into it yet. But there is support is really important, because like if you have a net zero target, then you need carbon removal, and if you need carbon removal in the future, you have to get working on it now and spend a part of your climate budget, because otherwise these solutions are not going to be available to scale. Like even if you poured like absurd amounts of money into carbon removal in 2050, it would still take like decades to create that industry, because you need to have the permits to develop the technologies, bring them down the cost curve, like build out all these facilities, develop the whole infrastructure for the storage. Like it takes decades to build an industry, and we're going to need billions. Like in any case, we need some billions of carbon removal. So if you don't get started now, it's just not available at that kind of scale later on. And we need more companies to help out this, also as players.
Amazing. Well, I'm glad you're in the space pushing it forward. I imagine you as some sort of fund allocator across these technologies here in the next decade. Maybe I'm putting words in your mouth.
Well, I mean, certainly happy to have the ability to work on it, and also have the ability to help support companies through the fund, and thanks to the corporate donors that we have. So that's really, really cool.
Yeah, amazing. Well, thanks so much for coming on.
No, thank you.
Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security, our obligations to ourselves as well as others, all require us to make this effort, to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all men and for the progress of all people.